Hello, my name is Carolyn Gadet, and I'm the manager of the Saskatchewan Prairie Conservation Action Plan, or Pcapp. Welcome to Wild About Wetlands. This is a joint event co-hosted by Nature Saskatchewan and the Saskatchewan Prairie Conservation Action Plan. In the past, we've done these events in a small town with a supper and presentations focused on species at risk and hands-on like ranch planning activities. Unfortunately, we can't meet in person again this year, but we can still share information with you, so we're happy you could join us tonight. I'd like to start by stating that we respectfully acknowledge that we are in the traditional territories of many Indigenous nations and communities, past and present. For a millennia, they have worked to protect these landscapes and the life these areas sustain. And I would like to thank these original caretakers and acknowledge the ongoing work and presence of Indigenous peoples in Canada today. So this week is Prairie's Got the Goods Week, which is one of Pcapp's initiatives to bring attention to all of the ecological goods and services that Native Prairie has to offer. So this week there were presentations on prairie strips and pollination and Indigenous perspectives, and a few about wetlands. Tomorrow's presentation will be about how does reconstructed prairie and wetland affect carbon sequestration, which might be of interest to you. So if you are interested, you can just type in Prairie's Got the Goods in your search engine and you should be able to find our webpage. And all of the past presentations were recorded and are available on Pcapp's YouTube channel. And so you can also go to Pcapp's Facebook page for lots of information about ecological goods and services. And there's a lot of neat facts like how draining wetlands could potentially release 5 million tons of carbon, or that 600 species of plants and animals depend on wetlands for some aspect of their life cycle. So lots of interesting tidbits to check out. So this evening we have a nice lineup of speakers. We'll start with myself to give a brief overview of what Pcapp is. And then Rachel Ward from Nature Saskatchewan will provide an update on their Stewards of Saskatchewan programs. And then we'll have Carmen Koweski, the Moose Jaw River Watershed Stewards, provide an update. And then Krista Connick-Todd with Pcapp will discuss mountain suckers. And then we'll close out the evening with Dr. Nick Cairns, who will go over amphibians that exist in Saskatchewan. So just a little bit of housekeeping before we begin. A reminder to all of our listeners out there, you are currently muted and we can't see you in case that's a concern. I think there might be an option to only view the presentation, not the webcam, if bandwidth is an issue where you are. If you have any questions during any of the presentations, feel free to type your questions in the Q&A section of the Zoom window at any time during the presentation, and then questions will be answered at the end of each presentation as time permits, so we might not be able to get to all of them. This event is being recorded and will be uploaded to Pcapp's YouTube channel as well as Nature Sask's YouTube channel in the near future. I would like to take a moment to note that financial support for today's workshop is provided by Environment and Climate Change Canada, the Mosaic Company, Saskatchewan Cattlemen's Association, TC Energy, the Elsa Wild Animal Appeal of Canada, Saskatchewan Ministry of Environment, Fish and Wildlife Development Fund, SaskTel, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Neotropical Migratory Bird Conservation Act. So as I mentioned before, we really appreciate you joining us tonight for this event, and I will get Rachel to talk about the door prizes.
Hello, so we will be offering 3 door prizes to attendees tonight. So we will be selecting those after the webinar has finished and you will be receiving an email. And we do have 3 options for door prizes. We have our Birds of Saskatchewan book. You can have the choice of either our Monarch long sleeve shirt or a Burrowing Owl t-shirt, or our backyard bird feeding guide. So when we email the door prize winners, we'll be giving you that option.
Awesome, thanks, Rachel. And so I'm starting the presentations this evening with a brief overview of what Pcapp is, for those of you who don't know, and then we'll move on to the other presentations. So Pcapp started in 1998 as a partnership to represent the collaborative efforts of multiple interests toward native prairie conservation. So our vision is healthy native prairie ecosystems as vital parts of our vibrant and strong communities. The Pcapp partnership brings together 33 partners consisting of producers, industry, provincial and federal governments, environmental non-government organizations, and educational institutions working towards that common vision of prairie and species at risk conservation in Saskatchewan. So here we have our 33 partners listed, and we meet twice a year to discuss native prairie issues with the hopes of identifying knowledge gaps and reducing duplication and working towards a better public understanding of and appreciation of native prairie. So we have 3 focus areas to prioritize our actions. So native prairie awareness and appreciation, responsible land use on native prairie, and native prairie ecosystem management. So many of our activities fall within more than one of these focus areas. And to achieve like an integrated approach to prairie conservation, each of the focus areas address the 3 Pcapp partnership goals. So there's the ecosystem goal, the cultural goal, and the economic goal. So we want native prairie to be conserved and restored, to be part of like a functioning landscape, for it to be like a valued part of our identity as Saskatchewan people, and that it can improve livelihoods if it's used sustainably. So we work these goals into each of our activities. So our first focus area, the objective is to increase awareness of ecological, cultural, and economic importance of native prairie and biodiversity to various audiences. And so some examples of those activities that fit under this focus area are like our native prairie speaker series. We've had a speaker series for over 10 years. And I think in 2015, we started doing webinars way before the pandemic. So I think we were one of the first, and rather than just like in-person presentations, and it's been like a success since. We have our Native Prairie Appreciation Week that occurs in June, and it's to promote native prairie and species at risk to the general public. So there's sometimes a tour or webinars, there's like a kids poster contest, a social media photo contest. We hand out like native seeds at farmers markets. There's also a declaration by the ministry or the Minister of Agriculture and the Minister of Environment, as well as declarations in the major cities, just to increase that awareness. We also increase appreciation and awareness through social media. So Caitlin Moreau-Seiler is our education or stewardship coordinator, and she prepares like a social media campaign once a month where information is shared about a species at risk or another topic like invasive species, or like a pollinator week or a migratory bird week, and things like that. We also have a monthly newsletter that is shared to over 2,000 subscribers. And we also offer 2 free education programs. So there's Adopt a Rancher for grade 10s, where they learn about a ranch and they have a field trip and actually see a ranch. And sometimes it's the only chance these kids have of like actually seeing native prairie. We also have Taking Action for Prairie, which is for grades 6 to 8, where the students develop an action plan for their school. We also often have a booth at Agribition to talk to kids about and landowners about native prairie and species at risk. So the objective here is to provide evidence-based information about native prairie and promote beneficial management practices within like a working landscape. So again, we have our speaker series again, which is a great way to share information. and Caitlin does a great job of finding like excellent speakers. We also have our Prairie's Got the Goods Week, like I mentioned, is this week. That started in 2017 as a way to share information about ecological goods and services provided by Native Prairie. And Pcapp also publishes articles in the Beef Business magazine about species at risk or beneficial management practices or other topics that might interest the 10,000 subscribers. And then we also have our Native Prairie Restoration Reclamation Workshop, which is a conference for a couple hundred people where there's information shared about seeding native species, how to restore aspects of native prairie, like the microorganisms, sort of the biocrust, and different techniques on how to do that. And then the objective here is that like management is a positive or has a positive impact on biodiversity, species at risk, and ecosystem health. So under this focus area, again, we have the Native Prairie Speaker Series, but we've also developed like booklets on how to sustainably manage native prairie. Pcapp has also been developing guides on managing habitat for species at risk. We've done 9 species so far, and we're finishing up a guide that combines all the habitat attributes of the species to see where their habitat needs overlap and contrast to help like management decisions. And then we also plan workshops for land managers with various information that might interest them. And hopefully next year we'll be able to do them in person again. And so with that, we can, like I can answer questions after Rachel's turn if we have time, or you can send me an email at my email address there.
All right, hello. So I am Rachel Ward. I'm a Habitat Stewardship Coordinator with Nature Saskatchewan. So we'll tell you a little bit about Nature Saskatchewan and give you a bit of an update on our programs. So at Nature Saskatchewan, we are a voice for nature in Saskatchewan. Our vision is humanity in harmony with nature, and our mission is to engage and inspire people to appreciate, learn about, and protect Saskatchewan's natural environment. We are Saskatchewan's largest volunteer-driven nonprofit naturalist organization with over 70 years of observing, documenting, and working to protect native species and natural ecosystems. We deliver numerous education and stewardship programs, and we have approximately 600 members and 16 affiliated nature societies. Our Stewards of Saskatchewan programs focus on habitat conservation through landowner stewardship. So our program goals include conserving prairie habitat through landowner stewardship, monitoring populations, increasing awareness and knowledge, and promoting habitat enhancement and restoration. We help to conserve prairie habitat suitable for target species at risk and other wildlife through voluntary landowner stewardship. So we currently have 988 participants conserving approximately 850,000 acres of species at risk habitat. Population monitoring is done in a few different ways. So we send out annual census cards to participating landowners to ask if they've seen that species that summer or not. We also have our hoot line. So we get sightings called into this from the general public as well as landowners. So those are called into our hoot line at 1-800-667-4668. And then we do also conduct plant searches with our rare plant rescue team for target species at risk. So with the permission of landowners, the search crew will survey the land to seek out target rare plant species. And this has been able to find previously unknown occurrences of some of these target species. And they also conduct population monitoring of known locations for those target plant species. With landowner permission, we share these species locations with the Saskatchewan Conservation Data Center. The rare plant rescue team data has contributed to downlisting of several of those species at risk, and our plovers on shore data has also helped to identify critical habitat for the piping plover. And approximately 50% of the burrowing owl data is from our Operation Burrowing Owl program. We are also involved in education and awareness through things like news releases and articles, posters, and presentations like the one here today. So we do public presentations throughout the province, as Carolyn said, often in person, but some of them are virtual like tonight as well. And then for our participating landowners, we do provide personalized gate signs, as well as conservation awareness days and a conservation toolbox, which is full of resource materials that we've created, like fact sheets, booklets, and they're also provided with a species at risk newsletter and calendar. We do also provide funding for habitat enhancement projects to improve or enhance habitat for burrowing owls, sprogs, pipits, piping plovers, and ferruginous hawks. So these are done with a 50-50 cost share for things like native seeding, wildlife-friendly fencing, alternate water sources, and fencing around ferruginous hawk nest sites. So the wildlife-friendly fencing is a 4-strand fence with a smooth top and bottom wire, as you can see in the top left picture there. The highest strand is 40 inches or less off the ground, and the lowest wire is at least 18 inches off the ground. This allows pronghorns to go under the fence without becoming caught up, and also lets other wildlife go over top, such as deer. The alternate water sources provide off-site watering. This helps to reduce disturbance to piping plover habitat during breeding season. And that water development can also help landowners graze a pasture that they weren't able to as easily without a water source. The fencing around ferruginous hawk nest sites goes around nesting platforms or trees that have ferruginous hawk nests to prevent those from getting damaged. So we have 5 different stewardship programs. Our flagship and first program is Operation Burrowing Owl, which was initiated in 1987. Then in 2002, Rare Plant Rescue Program was started, followed by Shrubs for Shrikes in 2003, Plovers on Shore in 2008, and in 2010, we created the Stewards of Saskatchewan Bannership Program, which covers all other species at risk. Operation Burrowing Owl targets the burrowing owl and has 346 participants to date, conserving approximately 210,000 acres. Our Rare Plant Rescue Program targets 16 different plant species. 9 of those are federally listed species at risk, and currently has 86 participants protecting approximately 250,000 acres. The Shrubs for Shrikes program is focused on the loggerhead shrike and currently has 288 participants protecting approximately 146,000 acres. The Plovers on Shore program is targeting the piping plover and currently has 57 participants protecting approximately 134 miles of shoreline. And lastly, our Stewards of Saskatchewan Banner program is focused on all other species at risk. So this includes things like our monarch butterflies, northern leopard frogs, western tiger salamander, sprogs pipit, and many more. And it now has 211 participants protecting approximately 238,000 acres of habitat for species at risk. We do also participate in other initiatives. So we encourage youth to build relationships with nature through Nature Quest and Inner Nature. And we encourage citizen science through Naturehood, Nature Watch, and the Important Bird Areas Caretaker Network. We do also produce several publications, including the Blue Jay, which is our quarterly journal, Birds of Saskatchewan, and the Backyard Bird Feeding book, those door prizes for today. And we also maintain and operate the Last Mountain Bird Observatory, where they have monitored number and species of migrating songbirds for over 20 years. We do also host meets or gatherings in the fall and the spring. So we want to say a big thank you to the stewards involved in our programs. They are really the backbone of everything that we do and the reason that we've been able to continue for so many years. They are the ones that are managing and caring for both the habitat and the species. And it's because of their care that many of these species at risk that we deal with still have habitat. So a big thank you to our stewards and to everyone here tonight.
And thanks, Rachel. That was awesome. It doesn't look like we have any questions, so we can move on to our next presenter. Carmen Koweski is the current executive director of the Moose Jaw River Watershed Stewards and started with the organization in the summer of 2019. Carmen is currently an articulating agrologist with the Saskatchewan Institute of Agrologists and has worked in environmental conservation since 1998. Carmen has always enjoyed nature and is usually found outdoors enjoying the natural environment. So welcome, Carmen.
Thank you. I'm just going to stop my video and get my screen up here. Okay, so hello everybody. So I'm with the Moose Jaw River Watershed Stewards. Moose Jaw River Watershed Stewards was created in 2003 and became, I guess, a legal entity, a legal corporation in 2006. So our mandate is to protect source water protection and general watershed health. So my elevator pitch is we protect rivers, lakes, streams, aquifers, wetlands. And our vision is to have an engaged and educated community that works together to guarantee that future generations experience a healthy and vibrant watershed. Our mission is to develop and implement projects and partnerships that improve the well-being of our watershed. And then we have a list of values. So education and engagement, partnerships, conservation and sustainability, protectors, respectful, and neutral. So we have 3 staff currently, myself, Taylor Kell, who is our agri-environmental technician, and Stephanie Huel, who is our watershed technician. Our office is located in Moose Jaw. And I just wanted to acknowledge all of our partners and sponsors that help us do all the programming that we do. So today I'm just going to go over some of the projects that we did in 2021. These are the projects that are, the theme was wetlands, so I kind of wanted to do things that we do around riparian areas and wetlands. So the first project I'm going to talk about is our purple loosestrife pull. Gibson Energy has been a sponsor of this for the last 2 years. In 2021 was our 2nd year of pulling purple loosestrife. And this is our volunteer and our staff team. So there's our summer student Grace and Stephanie and Taylor, and then our group of volunteers. So I just wanted to point out where some of these activities are happening. So the purple loosestrife full, actually the Gibson Energy refinery is right here. And so there's a big patch of purple loosestrife. We kind of started over here and then moved into this area. So if people are not familiar with purple loosestrife, it's quite aggressive. It invades wetlands and typically will eventually choke them out and take over, and they don't allow for the natural vegetation to grow. I did a little research. It looks like purple loosestrife was introduced from Europe in around the early 1800s, but they really started noticing it in Manitoba and wetlands in the 1950s, and then in Saskatchewan in the 1990s. It is quite aggressive. It can produce 2.7 million seeds in a year, and the seeds can lay dormant for 10 years or more. Right now in Canada, the Canadian government has approved 5 biological control beetles that help control purple loosestrife. Because it is in our riparian areas, it is difficult to control with chemicals, of course. And so this biological control can help, I guess, keep things at bay. But the best strategy for purple loosestrife is to pull it. So here are just some pictures. You can just kind of see the extent of the patch down by the river. And this is kind of our little bit of after, just kind of shows, you know, how much the volunteers pulled. I think they were out there for a full day. They started in the morning and worked as long as they can, but it was quite hot. So they did the best that they could. And we are going to do a 3rd year. We think 1 more year of pulling should help with that patch in particular. And so this year we're going to go out again and do it again. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is yellow flag iris. So yellow flag iris, we had reports, we had some people in and around Moose Jaw just phone us in 2020 and reported sightings of yellow flag iris because of course it was in bloom at the time and it was easy to identify. So here are just some pictures of that first pull. Here's that first patch. We had to get a canoe and kind of dock ourselves and pull out as much as we could. So yellow flag iris is interesting. It's not on the Saskatchewan invasive species list yet, but it is, you know, throughout Canada, throughout the United States. It is toxic. It's toxic to humans and animals, and it can burn human skin. Again, it's one of those riparian invaders. It invades, you know, ditches, wetlands, streams, lake shorelines. It reproduces through seed dispersal, but it also can reproduce by roots, by root rhizomes. And so any little pieces of the plant that break off can actually form a new plant. The seeds also float on water in the spring and fall, and so it kind of allows them to spread quite quickly. The other thing with the rhizomes is the roots can connect underground. And so you can have this extensive root system of plants. And so they, again, can spread quite quickly and just crowd out native vegetation. We usually put any invasive species that we encounter on an app called IMAP Invasives. And we have not seen any other instances of yellow flag iris. The locations that we find it are in around our urban park in Moose Jaw called Wakamo. And at one time, people did live down in that area. There are a few people still there, but they've really kind of tried to get people to move out of the floodplain. And so we think that, you know, at one time, these were just garden plants that once people left and once there was flooding in that area, then they were able to spread. Last year, when we did go out and do some observations, there was actually quite a bit of yellow flag iris. And so, you know, we're going to try over the next few years to just identify patches and try to get rid of it. The next area I'm going to talk about is Plaxton Lake. So Plaxton Lake is the confluence of the Thunder Creek and the Moose Jaw River. And it's a big area. It's part of Wakamo Valley Park. It's a nice area for people to hang out in. There's docks. There's a big area people can canoe and kayak. The watershed typically monitors for zebra and quagga mussels every year. We do monitor, we have one, I guess, lake. It's a reservoir in our watershed at, it's called Watson Reservoir. So we do monitor that. But this year, my technician, Taylor, wanted to put a substrate sampler, which is this little guy here. It's just basically a pipe attached to a string. It's got a little cement to weight it down. And we just hang it off a dock, and then we check it every month. Just to see if there's any signs of zebra or quagga mussel on it. They're quite destructive. We don't want them in our waterways. Saskatchewan has done a really good job of trying to get the word out there. They have a campaign called Drain Your Boat, and they have mobile units that go out and check boats being transported. They've also have border security checking boats that come in from the United States. And last year, they found, I think, 8 boats that did have the mussels in them that needed to be decontaminated. So clean, drain, dry your boat and equipment, and keep them out of our waterways. The next project I want to talk about in Moose Jaw was we partnered with Co-op Community Spaces and the school board and the Prince Arthur School, and we built a food farm. As part of the building of this food farm, we did a little exercise called Yellowfish Road. So some of the concepts of the food farm are, organic gardening, biodiversity, pollinators. We're supporting pollinators. We have bird baths and a bat house and bee baths. We have lots of native species in the garden. And so we wanted the kids to understand the connection between organic gardening and watering and storm drain health. So what Yellowfish Road, what the program is you get a stencil and yellow paint, and you go out in the neighborhood and you paint your storm drains. You put that fish stencil and leave a yellow fish on the storm drain. And then you go about the neighborhood and you drop off door knockers just with information, just reminding people that any water that goes into storm drains is not treated and it goes straight to the river. And so if you have, oil in your driveway or you're washing your car, all that soap and everything goes into the river. So it's just a good reminder for people. And it was a good activity for the kids. And here's just a picture of the garden. We're going to complete it in June of this year. There's a geodetic dome greenhouse. It's one of a kind. This was from a company in Ontario, but there's not very many of them in Western Canada. And then this is a food forest. And so there's actually 7 food forest guilds. We also created a learning circle with a native spiral. I think this slide here shows the native spiral, native plant spiral that we put in the center as a feature for the learning circle. And the kids also last year started growing seeds in the classroom and then planted. You can see the garden boxes here, planted the seeds, and it's just been a great community project. Another thing that we do to support just wetlands and wildlife and getting the information out there is a poster contest. COVID did make it a little bit more difficult because it was harder to get into the classroom, but typically we like to go into the classroom, talk to children about wetlands and watersheds, and then have them do some posters. So this is just some of our winners from last year. The next thing that we do is every year we collect leafy spurge beetles. So we collect them from Besant Campground, which is just by Mortlach, between Mortlach and Cairnport on the #1 highway here. And every year you can collect leafy spurge beetles in kind of the first couple weeks of July. That's when they breed, they come up out of the ground and then kind of breed on top. So then we're able to get in there with our nets and collect the beetles. And then what we do is we release them throughout the watershed. So we'll release them in community pastures or towns where there's really bad infestations. And then landowners as well will contact us and get bags of beetles to release in their pastures. So here's just a picture of us collecting the beetles. There's our nets. A couple of years ago, we had Sask Energy sponsor our leafy spurge beetle collection. So we purchased 6 new nets. And what you do is you basically collect them in this funnel, and then you put them in a bag. You have to tape the bag with duct tape because they like to crawl out. And then that same day, you kind of deliver it to the landowner, drop it in your spot, and let them out. We've also, I think last year was year 4 or 5 that we've dropped them in a certain spot in Wakamo Valley, the urban park in Moose Jaw, because we also wanted to create a bit of a colony there. And so this summer we are going to actually do some counting just to see if that colony has established and how strong it is. Because if you have a good, strong established colony, then you can collect from that colony and then spread them to other areas. Last year, we created Watershed Wonders education kits. This was a pilot project, and it was shared amongst 5 watersheds actually. But my technician, Stephanie, built all the kits. She did an excellent job. And these kits are available to be lent out to schools and, homeschoolers, camping groups, summer camps. They're themed, and they just teach children basic concepts about watersheds, beavers, water quality, and just how like buffer strips and things like that will work to keep your water clean. They've been quite popular. And we've had requests for people to have us build them kits. So that's something that we are also exploring right now. So I just wanted to go over some of the programs that we have coming up for 2022-23. So the first one is we are having a new Bmp program that is targeted at climate resiliency in agriculture. And so the 3 practices that we will be encouraging producers to adopt are rotational grazing, nitrogen management, and cover crops. We're developing, we're right in the middle of developing right now. And so I can't give too much information, but it is launching kind of in April, May of this year. So we're just kind of refining everything and then going to put it out. It will be province-wide. So if there's any, I don't know where people are from, but you can definitely just, shoot me an email at admin@mgriver.ca or give the office a call, and we can, connect you with the appropriate watershed and take your name. And then when we do have more information, we'll let you know. What I can tell you is it's a partnership between Manitoba and Saskatchewan, and it will deliver $40 million of programming in the next 2 years. The other program that we have that is provincial or province-wide is the Tree for Life program. So last year we gave out 24,000 trees in Saskatchewan. That was through 9 watershed groups. We have a network of watersheds, and there's 9 of us. So we gave out those trees. This year, we are going to charge a little bit for trees. You need a minimum bundle of 10, and they're $5 a tree. If people order 26 bundles or more, then they get a 30% discount. So it goes down to $3.50 a tree. The tree species available are blue spruce, white spruce, hill poplar, prairie sky poplar, sandbar willow, and pussy willow. So orders need to get in by May 1st. So you can visit our website at mjriver.ca, or you can go to saskwatersheds.ca, and it will bring you to an e-commerce site, and you can, pay by credit card or debit and get your order in. Once all the orders are in, then we'll be contacting people and delivering the trees. And then, of course, the leafy spurge beetle collection, we do it every year, and we take orders from landowners who are interested in releasing beetles on their land. We just ask, for a donation, or if you have time, come out and volunteer with us and collect beetles. We usually work with other watersheds and have probably a group of 10 to 12 people out there, and probably collect between 50 and 75,000 beetles in a day. So it is time consuming, but if people can come out, we've heard great feedback from landowners. Lots of landowners that do release beetles find that it does definitely knock back the patch. It doesn't eradicate it, but it definitely, helps. And especially if you have leafy spurge in around water, this is a really good strategy. Last year, we actually had the city of Regina come out as well and collect because they wanted to release beetles at their dump site, their landfill site. They have a leafy spurge problem out there. So that's it. So if anyone has any questions, and thank you.
Thank you, Carmen. That was great. Now I'll have Caitlin moderate. There's a few questions in the Q&A, and we have a few minutes for Carmen to answer those.
Yes, so we have a few questions here. So Larry and Jane are asking, what do the leafy spurge beetles do?
Yeah, so the leafy spurge beetles actually eat the root of the leafy spurge. And then, like I said, they will breed for a couple weeks. So that's when they come up from the roots and kind of feast on the top of the plant. And that's when you're able to collect them. So they do feast on the roots and just, I guess, kind of control. And then once you establish, like they say, you need to deposit beetles for about 5 years, and then you should have a colony established at your site.
Great. So Amy is asking, can other parts of the province borrow kits, or do other watershed areas have similar kits to lend? She is in PA.
Yes. So the watersheds that have kits are the ones in the south. So we have Swift Current, Old Wives, Moose Jaw, Walkwater, and then Southern Saskatchewan watershed also has kits. Probably for PA, South Sask would be the closest. They're in Saskatoon. So if you want, you could just send me an email and I could connect you with them. But definitely, yes, there are kits available, and we've had some pretty good feedback. People seem to like them.
So do you pull loosestrife from that one location near Moose Jaw, or are there other locations that have bad infestations that you try and get to?
Well, we haven't, I guess the last few years we've been monitoring the river in Moose Jaw and around Wakamo Valley. So we've just been targeting that area. We haven't really done much outside, but yeah, I mean, it's something that we like to do, but it is time consuming, and we like volunteers to come out. So we're just going to keep working at it, trying to get volunteers, get sponsors, and just pick away at the river. There's lots in Moose Jaw to deal with, and then I guess go from there.
So that's all the questions we have for now. If anybody else has any that they'd like to send in really quick, I think we still have minute or two.
I actually had a question that was like loosestrife related. There's a patch in Regina where like we used to live, and can we just go and pull it ourselves, or is there like some type of, I don't know, do you need to ask for permission? Yeah.
No, you don't need to ask for permission. Yes, you can definitely go pull it yourself. The best thing to do is pull it and then let it dry. And then you can either burn it or bring it to, I guess, a landfill. Like, you just want to be careful that you don't spread it around.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. But yes, definitely, you can definitely go out. They're big plants. They're almost taller than cattails, some of them. And depending on where they are, sometimes they might be hard to pull out, but if they're usually not too bad because they're, on water's edge and sandy soil sometimes, so it's easier to get them. Yeah. We actually, and kind of a neat story, the first year we went and did the purple loosestrife pull, we drove past a house that was very close to the location, and they had purple loosestrife in their flower garden in the front. They're beautiful plants, so you can understand why people put them in their yards. So we actually got some literature and went and talked to them, and they had thought it was a different plant called speedwell, but it's not speedwell. The one way to tell if it's leafy spurge is the stem is actually like has sides. It's almost like a hexagon. It's like 6 sides. Okay. So that, and speedwell is more round. So that's how you can tell the difference. And so, yeah, they were very good about it. They took it all out of their yard. So, yeah, people just don't know, they don't realize what it is.
For sure. I mean, a lot of anything of what we do is awareness, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Once people know better, they'll do better.
Yeah. And then, and with plants too, it's easy to mix them up, right?
For sure.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much, Carmen. That was awesome. Next up, we have a recorded presentation by Krista Connick-Todd with the South of the Divide Conservation Action Program. Krista started as a rangeland agrologist with Pcapp in 2015 and is currently a co-executive director of Pcapp. Okay, so I am going to try to get this to work.
Thanks for attending the webinar this evening. I'm Krista Todd and I work with Pcapp, the South of the Divide Conservation Action Program. My presentation tonight will be on providing habitat for mountain sucker, which is a small fish listed as threatened on the Species at Risk Act. I work for Pcapp, which is an ecological conservation organization that focuses on the far southwest corner of Saskatchewan, encompassing the Milk River watershed. This area is very important to the protection of species at risk, largely due to the vast stretches of native prairie that remain in the area. As compared to a provincial average of somewhere around 15 to 20% of native prairie remaining on the landscape, the South of the Divide boasts 50% land cover still under native prairie. Because so many species at risk rely on native prairie for their habitat, this area is a hotspot for biodiversity. The Species at Risk Act was created in 2002 by the federal government. A number of species in the Southwest have been identified as being at risk. Around 24 species. Different from various provincial acts, the Federal Species at Risk Act provides protection for both the individual and its home. It has defined critical and important habitat. Critical habitat is a habitat necessary for the survival and recovery of a species. Critical habitat identifies areas that could make good habitat for the species based on both the sightings and desktop computerized mapping. Critical habitat identifies not just where the species is currently found, but also lands that would make good potential habitat for them. Land can be identified as critical habitat regardless of ownership. A variety of grassland birds, mammals, amphibians, and fish are listed on the Species at Risk Act, including long-billed curlew, northern leopard frog, and mountain sucker, which all rely on riparian habitats. Creeks that flow from the south slope of the Cypress Hills have been identified as being important habitat for mountain sucker, including Lone Pine Creek, Catton Creek, Conglomerate, and Battle Creeks, as well as parts of the Frenchman River itself. SODCAP has been working in those areas to maintain habitat for mountain sucker. The mountain sucker is a small fish with the typical sucker type of mouth. They can be dark green, gray, or brown, generally with a dark green or black strip along their sides. Adults are typically 12 to 15 centimeters long. They like to live close to the bottom of a creek and feed on algae and young larval insects. They prefer cool running water and a cobble or gravel base to the creek. They like creeks that are less than 2 meters deep. They were listed as threatened in 2010 in Canada. Their range is quite broad in the United States, but very limited in Canada. There are also separate populations found in the Saskatchewan and Nelson River watershed, as well as the Pacific population. The Milk River population is limited to the Milk River Basin in southern Alberta and Saskatchewan. They have only been found in 8 locations, which makes them particularly susceptible to habitat loss and degradation. Much like the northern leopard frog, they are often considered locally abundant in locations where they are found, but those locations themselves are limited. Several threats to maintaining healthy populations have been identified. The physical destruction of habitat is a significant threat. Activities such as intensive livestock grazing can decrease the health of the riparian area. Sedimentation is a threat closely tied to the surrounding land use and can be increased by excessive livestock impacts to the stream bank. Sedimentation can impact the base of the creek as well as the water clarity and turbidity. Changes in water level or availability is a threat related to either irrigation or prolonged drought. Changes in water levels and the resulting change in temperature in particular can impact breeding behavior, survival of eggs, and adult death due to being stranded when water levels are low. The introduction of non-native fish species can also negatively impact mountain sucker populations. In South Dakota, the introduction of brown trout has caused problems for mountain sucker. SODCAP has focused on the first 2 threats. Maintaining healthy riparian areas is essential to protecting habitat for mountain sucker. Lush overhanging vegetation helps to keep the water temperature cool, and deep-rooted vegetation along the edge of the creek helps to reduce sedimentation and other contaminants from entering the water. Healthy riparian areas also support a diverse population of insects, which provide food for mountain sucker. Working with ranchers who manage the land along these creeks to help them maintain or improve their riparian area will protect the habitat needed for mountain sucker, as well as other riparian-focused species such as the northern leopard frog. Riparian health is measured using a number of characteristics. A health assessment will look at how well the floodplain is vegetated and how much bare ground is present, the presence and abundance of weeds, the rejuvenation and utilization of preferred shrubs, the type of vegetation right along the stream bank and how deep-rooted it is, as well as whether or not the stream bank is changing course and if the flood water can reach the floodplain. SODCAP has worked with ranchers in the south slope of the Cypress Hills along these target creeks to initiate cost-share projects for activities such as off-site livestock watering systems, exclusion or cross-fence, and deferring grazing pressure. Improving and maintaining riparian areas is important to all the aquatic species that make these creeks and riparian areas their home. These projects help to take grazing pressure off the riparian area or add variety to the season of use, allowing for rest. These are cost-share projects. SODCAP works with the ranchers to create individualized management plans that meet both the ranchers' conservation goals and the habitat needs of the species. This cooperative approach to creating the management plan is important to the long-term success of the project. Riparian health assessments are completed before the management plan is created because you cannot manage what you do not measure, and they provide the baseline data to improve upon. But the most important aspect is the active management. It's the active management that makes these projects a success. A water system or fence alone does not impact riparian health. It's how they are used that is important. These projects recognize the time and effort it takes to implement plans to manage these important riparian areas and reduce grazing pressure in key locations. It's thanks to the commitment by these ranchers that the habitat is being maintained and protected. Here is an example of a project that has been initiated in the south slope of the Cypress Hills. We worked with a livestock producer who ranches along Lone Pine Creek. He had one large field where the cattle had free access to the riparian area. The project involved installing a cross fence to limit the time that the cows had access to the creek area and provide rest while the other half was being grazed. The family grazes one side of the creek and then the other, reducing the riparian impact by half. They also installed 2 off-site water systems to draw the cows away from the creek and up into the upland pasture. They are also deferring grazing on the 2 new pastures to avoid early spring use. I would like to take the opportunity to thank our funders who support these projects, the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, Department of Fisheries and Oceans Canada, and the Saskatchewan Stock Growers Foundation. I can be reached at 306-671-7656 or at westtech@sodcap.com. Diego can be reached at 306-737-4157 or diego@sodcap.com. Thank you very much.
Okay, so we have Diego here who can answer questions. If there's anyone who has questions about either mountain suckers or some of SODCAP's programs.
Yes, we do. I have a few questions, so I can get the ball rolling.
For sure.
Diego, you're there? There you are. See, you're unmuted.
Yes.
So where do the mountain suckers go in the winter? What do they do in the winter if they like that shallow creek water?
Yeah, in general, in this area, they go primarily to the Cypress Lake. In this particular area, they move to Cypress Lake area. Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's good to know, because I was curious if they like that short water or the shallow water where they must go. How many, since I guess the mountain sucker, the locations of them are so few, but how many landowners do you have doing projects for the mountain suckers right now?
Well, right now we have 5 producers that we have conservation agreement signed with, but we are looking for more producers that manage land intersecting this or target water course. That is our work area or target area is the Frenchman River and the Battle Creek system, and that include all the creeks like Caron Creek, Lone Pine Creek, Conglomerate Creek. But all this area, you know, in the southwest Saskatchewan, the Frenchman River and the Battle Creek system. So if there are some producers that own or lease lands intersecting this important water course for mountain soccer, we are please contact us, and we will evaluate the situation. We start initially this conservation agreement start with one riparian health assessment, where we use a protocol published by Pcapp that you can find in the website. That is a protocol that evaluates the health of the riparian area, and based on the ecological problems that we found there, we designed different activities or measures, conservation measures, to improve the stream bank and the riparian vegetation in the area. So, initially, mainly the main activities on these projects, at least for now, most of them are related to improving riparian vegetation and based on reduction of cattle pressure on the stream bank. So in some projects, we support activities related with fencing critical areas. Some of them is just providing one off-stream water supply for cattle, so the livestock not necessarily have to go to the creek and produce disturbance and trapping and, you know, and degrading the stream bank. So this kind of activity that improve the riparian vegetation is the ones that the Pcapp support, and always through conservation agreement. That conservation agreements are legally binding documents signed between Pcapp and the producer.
Okay, sounds good. Carolyn, do we have time for just one more question? Yeah, okay. So Diego, do you know how we can differentiate between the mountain sucker and the white sucker, and is there a place to report them?
Oh, I'm not actually a fish wildlife specialist, so I cannot say exactly about that. I'm plant ecologist, and okay. but I'm not sure about that. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. That's no worries. But I guess if anyone has questions or, you know, wants to report something, they can just contact Pcapp there.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great.
Yeah, sure. For example, Krista Conit, she will be able to identify most of the species on this watershed and in this water course in these creeks. Yeah.
Okay, that sounds good. Okay, thanks, Diego. Thanks so much.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks to Krista and Diego for that presentation and for answering those questions. Next, we have Dr. Nick Cairns. Nick is an ecologist and conservation biologist based in Val-Marie in southwestern Saskatchewan. His focus is on the biology of the northern Great Plains, particularly the semi-arid regions, but he has worked in a variety of places on a diverse assemblage of taxa. So some projects include habitat use and overwintering conditions in small snakes, mitigation strategies for turtle bycatch in inland fisheries, and the phylogenomics of frogs. So Nick, if you want to share your screen, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Carolyn. Appreciate it. I will share. Click the correct button so that I can share with sound. All right, can everyone see that? Are we good, Carolyn?
Yes.
All right, well, thank you. I've really enjoyed the talk so far, so thank you for inviting me. I'm hoping today we'll just chat some frogs now, because that is what I spend a good portion of my time chatting about. I'm also going to stay in the southwestern portion of the province, but if there are questions about some species a little further north, then we can talk about those too, or further south. So we're going to talk about the different species that call Southwest Saskatchewan home, and then we're going to focus in on northern leopard frogs and look at their recent plights. And then we're going to talk about some of the potential mitigations and things that people can do for them. So I'm just going to start. One second. I'm just going to turn on my laser pointer here. All right, I'm just going to start with a real basic primer of amphibian life cycles, because this is what most of the species in this area do. So amphibians typically lay their eggs in water. These then hatch out. So this is some chorus frog eggs here. These then hatch out into aquatic larvae in frogs. We would call these tadpoles. And they vary quite a bit. And their biology is largely dependent on what type of hydroperiod the species prefers. And so hydroperiod, you're going to hear this term a lot throughout the course of this chat. Hydroperiod is just how long a water body lasts, because that has massive effects on the type of species that can use it, both flora and fauna. And so amphibians, especially their larvae, are really tied to a particular hydroperiod. Some are more plastic, they can live in a more diverse assemblage of hydroperiods, but some are very tied to short or long hydroperiods. At that point, this is a hilled frog from BC. At that point, then once they've reached adulthood, as probably almost everyone's aware, they use loud vocalizations or calls to aggregate into appropriate water bodies. At which point, well, for at least all of the females and some of the males, they'll find an appropriate partner, and then they engage in external fertilization, very similar to fish. Now, I just want to point out that there are exceptions to all of these rules within amphibians and frogs specifically. But this is the general cycle that all of our species follow that occur in Saskatchewan. So I'm going to introduce a number of species, and we're going to start with the eggs and work through to their calls, and then we'll switch to the leopard frog. So that's why I just wanted to get back into the cycle so that everyone got that little primer. So we're going to start with my favorite species, and that is the spadefoot. I can't quite see under the little group of names there, but I'm going to just leave that. This is an arid adapted species. They live in some of the driest parts of North America. They lay their eggs in clusters. I'm not going to get too deep into egg form, but generally we're going to go clusters versus strings. And so they lay their eggs in clusters in shallow rain-fed pools with really short hydroperiods. Historically, they often use bison wallows throughout most of their range. They have relatively short, wide tadpoles, and they're quite similar to the baseline color of the substrate that they live in. So the dirt in that area, the bottom of the ponds, that's usually the sort of color that spadefoot tadpoles are. But they can have quite a bit of iridescence if you hit them in the right light, and they're quite pretty in some ways. The claim to fame for this species is larval plasticity. So their tadpoles have extremely fast development, and that rate of development can shorten or lengthen depending on the density of tadpoles in the water body, as well as how much water is left in the water body, although that might just be a metric of density in the water body. And so in some places, they can be from egg to toad or toad-like frog in as fast as 2 weeks, although in our area, it's usually a little bit slower, probably about 4 weeks, 5 weeks maybe. Beyond that, they're also extremely plastic in their morphology. So not just rate of development, but actual body shape. Normally they eat algae and detritus on the bottom, but if the conditions require, they can change into a carnivorous morph, which develops a larger head, stronger mouth, and actually captures and consumes tadpoles and fairy shrimp. And they'll regularly cannibalize each other. And so once these little monsters develop, they turn into this very toad-like adult. You'll usually hear people call them spadefoot toads. They are not true toads. And you can tell right off the bat that they're not toads because they have this vertical pupil. They also have sort of smooth and bumpy skins, and they don't have a true parotoid gland, which is a large gland on the neck that exudes toxin from true toads. Finally, they have a little spade on their foot, which is where they get their common name. Toads have some similar digging utensils, but it's not quite as well developed. They're highly nocturnal, and they breed quite late at night, even by frog standards. So a lot of people, even with them on their property, are unaware that they're there, despite the fact they are extremely loud and they have a really, really distinctive call that's kind of like a really sick duck snoring. So I'm going to just play that for you. Everyone just watch your sound on your computers, because some of these calls might come in a little loud. So that's the plain spadefoot. I should mention that the calls all come from Nature North, which is a great group in Manitoba that has a really excellent resource for all of these species and a number of others. The next species that we're going to look at is another dryland specialist, and that's the Great Plains toad. So this is a true toad, which means it lays its eggs in strings. So there'll be long strings of jelly with sort of semi-paired or almost paired eggs going down it, one egg from each ovary. And then the claim to fame, one of the claims to fame of this very cool looking toad is that it has the largest clutches of any amphibian in Canada. So there's a bit of trivia for you. A single female can lay up to 20,000 or even 40,000 eggs in a single breeding season. And so toad larvae are generally fairly nondescript little dark tadpoles. But the Great Plains toad is a little bit different from your typical toad. The tadpoles are quite a bit lighter, and they actually have reddish iridescence on their bellies if you ever saw underneath them. This is quite a large species when you get to the adult form, the terrestrial form. And they can be over 10 centimeters, so about 4 inches long, but that's without the legs. And like other true toads, they have horizontal pupils, kind of like a goat, and a big round body with, in this case, really nearly symmetrical dark green splotches ringed in white or cream. And each one of these will have multiple warts inside. The best way to identify this toad from other toads, though, is to look at the top of its head, where there's sort of a bony structure called the cranial crest. And in this case, it has a V-shaped cranial crest. And so this species, as I mentioned, is another dryland species, and they're typically associated with the same types of habitats you'd find spadefoots in. But in our area, they're even more so associated with sand. You'll find spadefoots in a fairly diverse assemblage of substrates, whereas in Saskatchewan and Manitoba, these guys are almost always associated with sand. They, like tadpoles, can take advantage of temporary pools, and if there's no spadefoots around, can develop quite quickly. However, they like to avoid pools with spadefoots in them because, as I mentioned, spadefoots are voracious tadpole-eating monsters, and so they try to avoid them, which means that they have adapted to, although being able to develop quite quickly, they will readily use fairly permanent water bodies and even surprisingly salty water bodies. Like the spadefoots, but even more so, these guys rely on heavy summer rains, and they have an almost insect-like trill. Toads generally have a trill. This one's a slightly different toad call. You'll hear a more typical one when we get to the Canadian toad. And when they're calling, they have a huge vocal sac that actually sticks up in front of their face and looks like a sausage. A very cool vocal sac. So on to the next toad. This also lays eggs and strings. So a lot of the things that I talked about with the Great Plains toad are going to apply to the Canadian toad. But this species has a much wider distribution. You're far more likely to see this species in Saskatchewan unless you're in the Great Sandhills or down right in the southeast corner. These have a much more typical toad tadpole. It is very just dark and nondescript with clear tail fins. And it's a very small tadpole for the size of the frog that it turns into. Like other toads, it has a horizontal pupil, and you can kind of see the parotoid glands here on the neck. And so those produce a toxin that you don't want to get in your mouth or let your dog play with. Unlike the Great Plains toad, if you look, each of these patches are darker green patches are much smaller, and each of them will only contain 1 to 2 warts. However, the best way to diagnose this species is still have a look at the cranial crest, because in this species, the cranial crest is basically 2 parallel ridges, which sometimes form into a single bony lump that we call a boss. It breeds in late spring, and it favors pools that have much longer hydro periods, even though they can get out and metamorph quite quickly. These are a much wetter land species. They're often using wet prairie and sort of riparian areas or forest floors. So they like things just a little bit wetter than the 2 arid species that we were talking about. And this has a more typical like call, which is a loud, explosive trill, but it's pretty short by toad standards. So just, again, your ears. Go. All right, and on to the smallest species on our list that we're going to cover today. This is the boreal chorus frog. It's actually a terrestrial tree frog. It lays clumps of eggs, so we're back to clumps again, and it sticks them to vegetation, just like the picture I showed in the life cycle stage. The tadpoles are fairly easy to identify compared to all the other tadpoles we've seen, because it's the only one with lateral eyes. That means the eyes are sticking out on the side of the head. So if you look at them from directly above, you'll actually see the eyes still. Whereas the other ones, you'll see the eyes sort of sticking within the frame of the body. So this is a spade foot here. You can see the eyes are kind of closer to the midline, whereas these are boreal chorus frogs, and their eyes are lateral on the sides of their heads. They'll breed in a huge variety of water bodies, from flooded fields to ditches to lakes. They can metamorph quite quickly, and they can live in fairly deep water, even with some predators present. The adults are distinctively small. So even though the tadpoles might be even bigger than some of the toad tadpoles we mentioned, the adults are actually shorter than the tadpoles. So they only really max out at like 2.5 centimeters, so like 1 inch and a bit. They have very short legs. It's kind of hard to see here, but they have very short legs. They're not particularly athletic little frogs. They're extremely variable in color. The base color can be gray, green, creamish color, brown. This is a fairly typical one around here in Val Marie. But they almost always have this black line that goes through the eyes and then a white lip. And then if you're looking at them very closely, you might see little disc pads, because again, they are a tree frog, so they'll have little circular discs. One of the most interesting thing about this species is their overwintering, because these are freeze tolerant. They actually produce their own antifreeze from the glycogen in their livers, but because they actively metabolize their own antifreeze, they don't want to do it over and over again. So they still seek out relatively stable environments like rodent burrows or ant mounds to avoid freeze-thaw cycles. The call of this is often described as a finger being drawn along the teeth of a comb. And I think almost everybody's going to be familiar with this one, because we're about to be inundated with this call for the next couple of weeks, hopefully, if it ever warms up a little bit. Although I'm hoping we get a bit more snow before that happens. All right, and on to the species that we're going to spend the rest of the chat on. This is our final species, and this is the leopard frog. So it's a ranid frog. This is a huge group of globally distributed frogs. The ranids are the so-called true frogs, which is a very weird term. I don't know why we insist upon putting true in front of things, but it works for now. They're what people usually imagine are frogs, which is probably where they got the term true frogs. They have long legs to make large jumps. They have big eyes and big mouths. They're usually semi-aquatic. And in North America, there's a ton of ranids. Primarily, if you move south and east, you'll get more and more species. But the leopard frog is our only ranid frog in this area. And they're actually fairly large by frog standards in our area. So they can be over 4 inches long, so 5 to 11 centimeters, depending on the type of food they've got as they've grown. And they're quite handsome. I think. You can see quite a variety of base colors, so you can get sort of brownish gray ones, green ones, even slightly almost bluish ones. And they almost always have dark splotches with a little halo, a lighter color around them. And then along their dorsal lateral, so they're sort of where their side meets their back, they have these dorsal lateral ridges, which are actually a little raised ridge that goes down the back. And sometimes it's in bumps itself. And these are usually sort of lighter colored or gold colored, like the ones you see here. If you flip them over, their bellies are pure white. So leopard frogs, like the rest of the species we've looked at, call from water for the most part. And the males will actually float on the surface calling. And sometimes, unlike the other species we've talked about, they may call underwater. Unlike the other species that we've talked about, they actually have paired vocal sacs. You can see both of their vocal sacs inflated here. They actually come out just above their shoulders. And this call doesn't carry that far, at least to human ears. And so you can often miss this species when being drowned out by chorus frogs or toads, depending on the area. But it's still a really interesting, complex call. And because the species often calls during the day, even though much of the actual breeding activity is in the evening, you can still go out and see this species call and actually observe their vocal sacs. The call is, like I mentioned, really cool, complex call with sort of two main parts: a low-pitched growl followed by several clucking noises. They also have a number of other calls, including a release call that both males and females use to reject overly amorous males. They also have a startle call. If you've ever walked along a dugout and had a frog go eh, and jump into the water, that's a leopard frog probably. And then they have a really unnerving scream if they're captured. Not always, but sometimes. So this is the breeding call. It's not as loud. This one comes from Leah Randall at the Calgary Zoo. You heard the growl, and these are the clucks. There's a growl, and then some clucks. It's a very cool call. So they have a really interesting biology compared to a lot of the other species, even though I find the other species pretty interesting as well. But these lay some very impressive egg masses. These egg masses can be up to 6,500 eggs per female. But they also share the site. So there's often huge masses, thousands and thousands and thousands of eggs in one spot. And it can be quite an impressive sight if you get to see a big one. When you look at them, this egg mass is not entirely inflated yet. The jelly actually gets bigger and absorbs water. But they'll have a large jelly coat around them, and then these little black dots in the center. Those are the embryos. But the actual black cap part is a big melanin-rich piece of tissue that actually protects the developing embryo from UV and also helps it gain heat. This species requires a fairly long hydro period, and you usually see them in ponds and oxbows that flood with spring meltwater. So they're not rain-driven, but like a lot of the species we've talked about so far. These sort of river-adjacent riparian areas like oxbows fill in the early spring and then isolate from the river. So there's usually less predators in there, and they warm up faster than the river. It also doesn't have flow, which is important when you have big ungainly egg masses like this. So the advantage of having a long hydro period is it means you have a long growth phase, because tadpoles are all about growth. So in our area, usually they'll start breeding at the end of April. And the eggs will hatch within a couple days to a week or two, depending on the temperature of the water body they're in. And then they start turning into tadpoles, and they will spend the next 3 to 4 months, 2 to 6 months, depending on the area, as a tadpole at various stages of development. Now, these are by far the largest tadpole you'll find in the Southwest, or generally in Saskatchewan. They can be over 120 millimeters, so 12 centimeters long, so 4.5 inches. And as you can see from the picture, they're quite streamlined. They're very strong swimmers and quite alert. You don't usually surprise this species in the same way you might surprise a toad tadpole. And so they take so long that in some areas they'll often overwinter as tadpoles. So as you can imagine, with a long hydro period and a large larvae like that, they're inextricably linked to water. But despite this, this species makes pretty substantial overland movements. So they can easily move 800 meters, or not easily, but they can move 800 meters in a day. And they're often found, or they can be found 8 kilometers away from where they were found the previous year. So what do they do on these forays? Well, they eat the same thing they did as a larval stage. They prey primarily on invertebrates, particularly beetles and spiders. However, vertebrates are definitely on the menu. Smaller frogs, including their own species, may be eaten. And then this was an observation we made on Highway 4 of a leopard frog eating a vole of some sort. I haven't been able to get a proper ID on it yet. But once all the mating and eating is done for the year, they return to the water. And they go to water bodies at this point that don't freeze to the bottom and preferably have high oxygen, which is a trick in this area. And there they'll just sit on the bottom waiting for spring, often quite exposed. You can see them through the ice quite regularly. And so we actually have a pretty good idea where leopard frogs occur in Saskatchewan. I was going to say Southwest Saskatchewan, but I think throughout the province it's about the same. They're large and they're obvious, and most people are familiar with them. You can find them in a huge diversity of habitats, both natural and man-made. They're very capable of colonizing new habitat, given their ability to travel over land. But in order to persist, they have to have access to warm, preferably nearly fishless waters to breed in, and cold, oxygen-rich waters to overwinter in. And this means that they're tied on both ends of their life histories to permanent water. And this is a complicated life history, and this habitat requirement leads to some fairly diverse risks that can affect them. Not the least of which is just basic contaminants, things like PCBs, fertilizers like ammonium nitrate, herbicides like glyphosate, or in areas with more corn, if we were further east or further south, atrazine. Beyond that, they're subject to a lot of global patterns that are affecting a number of species, such as changes in precipitation and temperature. Oops, I am ahead of my slide. Pardon me. So I just want to draw your attention to these maps here. These are maps of the percent days with snow cover in March. So this is 1971 and this is 2008. And the difference between these two pictures is 6 million kilometers squared of less snow cover. And so you could imagine, especially in our region, you can imagine that this much lost snow is going to have major impact on spring melt and primary productivity, and just the ability to flood and fill these water bodies that this species likes to breed in. And unfortunately, this is also exacerbated by human management practices. So when we channelize water bodies, as they do in some areas in southeastern Alberta, or control flow rates, as we do right here in southwestern Saskatchewan. So for example, in Val-Marie, we've not allowed for a full flood, like an overbank flood, for the last 2 years. And so the oxbows that the leopard frogs normally breed in have not been filled for the last 2 years. There's still some springs and stuff with active breeding, and we've found breeding in the river, but those aren't ideal habitats. They're too cold and there's too much movement. Beyond that, when you run a river at half bank or sub overflow, it actually causes more sedimentation, which can affect oxygen rates and sedimentation. So all of these can have fairly immediate effects on recruitment. We don't have a great estimate on or baseline for these species. Beyond that, there's a lot of other issues that we've talked about for other species, probably in any of these types of talks you've ever seen. Fragmentation and habitat conversion, especially near rivers, is a huge issue for this species. Part of that fragmentation is the massive toll that roads have on leopard frogs. A busy road, sometimes during the year, in occasions where, for example, metamorphs are leaving after turning from tadpoles into little frogs, you may kill thousands and thousands and thousands of frogs in a night. And there's no way to replicate that in nature. It's not like a kid scooping a leopard frog out and putting it in an aquarium and that frog dies and it's sad, but that's one frog that would likely have been eaten by a heron or a snake or something like that. This is thousands and thousands of individuals. In other parts of the range, not so much here, but in Montana, Alberta, and BC, invasive species have been a real problem. Things like bullfrogs or trout introductions. So those are genuine problems for this species as well. This is actually a bullfrog, not a leopard frog, but just an example. There are also some really frog-specific threats because fragmentation and roadkill and issues with water flow are pretty universal, but there are some really frog-specific threats as well. This includes things like odd patterns of malformations, where leopard frogs will grow additional limbs. This appears to be tied to a parasitic infection caused by a trematode. So in and of itself, not unnatural, but the high prevalence of this, as well as other parasitic infections, has been tied to immunosuppression caused by herbicides. There's also a variety of viruses like ranaviruses that cause major local die-offs. And beyond that, there's also the pandemic of chytrid. So in the 1970s, Cytrid fungus, which is a skin fungus, began sweeping the world, and it's estimated to have affected about 30% of all amphibian species, and it's been implicated in the extinction of 200 species globally. And this leaves a red telltale legs like this, and it kills adult frogs, but tends to leave tadpoles, fish, and turtles alive, unlike ranavirus. And so unfortunately, this has led to really drastic declines and local extirpations for leopard frogs. And Western North America has particularly been bad hit. So these lighter red areas are historic range that are no longer part of the range. There are no leopard frogs in these areas anymore. So British Columbia lost almost all their leopard frogs, and Alberta's leopard frogs have been sort of sucked into the far southern portion of the province. Looking a little bit closer at Alberta, this is pre-2000 observations, and this was an intensive survey that took place between 2000 and 2006, and this is all they got. So there are some groups that are doing a lot to try and bring some of these species back. To try and counter this, the Calgary Zoo and Parks Canada have begun localized reintroduction programs. So you can see there's a couple of the sites in BC where the Calgary Zoo has been reintroducing frogs. But these are really localized. One of the things that people are now really appreciating the utility of is monitoring. Now, leopard frogs are not the only species of frog that have experienced declines in the last 40 years. Part of the interest we have in them is that they were so common and they were so observable before that declines were really noticeable, whereas other species can disappear without us really noticing. And so getting baselines of distributions, seasonality, activity of leopard frogs and other frogs locally can help us understand population health at a fine scale, but also at a broad scale. It also helps us get some idea of the trajectory of these populations when you look at the same spot over years. Some of the best work, there is some work being done by extensively trained researchers that are using, say, remote listening devices, but some of the most useful research is being done by citizen scientists on this, collecting fantastic data on where these frogs occur, and just basically listening to their own local ponds. So what we can do with that is get out and listen to our own local ponds, take our kids, take our families, and go out and listen to things. And there's lots of different programs and ways to report that. There are some like Frog Watch that have their own programs and methods that they want you to follow, so that there's a really consistent methodology. And there's others like iNaturalist that just, you take a picture of a frog and you upload it, and people will argue about what type of frog it is, but it's still really good data. If you're gonna do this though, try to make sure you report it to somebody, get some data that you can share with someone else, and make sure you wash your gear, because we don't want to spread any of this disease, because we don't know exactly which cause is causing all these declines. And so it's best to try to avoid any causes. Thank you for your attention. I hope I didn't go over, but I'm happy to take any questions if we have time.
Thank you so much, Nick. That was a great presentation on amphibians. They really don't get enough attention and they're so neat. Some of the information vocabulary brought me back to my vertebrate biology classes. Just all came flooding back. So that was awesome.
That's what we aim for is flashbacks of tests from from second year university.
So now Emily will moderate any questions there might be for Nick.
Yeah, so what a fantastic presentation. So we have a few questions here. So you mentioned one of the calls was from Calgary Zoo, but what location did you record the other sounds that you played at?
Oh, those are all from Nature North, which is a group in Manitoba that has a lot of information on amphibians. They just have some calls on their website. So those are all Manitoba ones. Okay.
A few life cycle questions. So what is the typical lifespan of the adult stage? And if they can overwinter as tadpoles, what is the longest they can remain at that stage?
Okay, this is for leopard frogs?
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to, I don't have all of the maximum life histories and whatnot for that species, but I would say they usually don't overwinter, especially in Saskatchewan, just because they can't guarantee that it's going to be wet enough for them to stay overwinter in some of these pools. So usually by August, they're little frogs, so they're metamorphed. And then the adult life stage, the whole life stage will, or lifespan of the species will be sort of 4 or 5 years. That would be a fairly old leopard frog. I imagine most of them don't last that long. But that one eating the vole was probably quite elderly because it was gigantic.
So a question here about wood frogs. What is the furthest south for wood frogs? They have this, Richard, who's asking this. Richard has a sighting in Moose Jaw, and it's the first that he is aware of. So he's wondering how far south they go.
Yeah, that'd be very south. You know, I'm not completely sure. I usually associate them with forest and sort of temporary pools in that type of habitat. I have no idea if one in Moose Jaw would be a natural occurring one or someone went up to PA and brought one down. So I can't be sure. But yeah, they're well represented in Saskatchewan. But I don't know exactly how far south. Usually I would deem it by habitat. So if you have some good little woods in your area, maybe you've got them. Maybe you've got a resident population that hasn't been recorded. Yeah, let people know, because it's pretty neat. And sometimes you get these little relic populations of some species.
Okay, lots of questions coming in here. So how do you attract leopard frogs or make the environment friendly for them? We used to have them, but haven't seen them in a few years, possibly due to drought. And that is Lana.
Yeah, the drought's a tough on a lot of amphibians, but it's particularly tough on leopard frogs. I don't know how you necessarily attract them. I would say if you've got some permanent water that doesn't freeze to the bottom, that's a good start. Or if you have permanent water or semi-permanent water in late summer, you might get some metamorphs moving into your area. But I can't say there's any particular guaranteed way to attract frogs to a yard. I know that the chorus frogs, anytime I leave any sort of wood pile or anything for any longer than a month or two, I usually get them in there. But the leopard frogs don't generally follow that same rules. They're usually, in the wet fields. But if you're in a floodplain, if you have a pond, they'll probably show up.
Okay, next question here. Are there any issues of people catching leopard frogs and keeping them as pets? You mentioned keeping them in an aquarium.
Oh, yeah, I don't think it's allowed. I don't know the provincial rules. I know that anytime I'm collecting frogs, I have to get a scientific permit. I have no idea what the rules are for kids collecting them to see them. I personally, that's how I learned about frogs and everything else. So I can't speak like, don't do it, because although you probably shouldn't, and you certainly shouldn't release things that you've been keeping for a long period of time, just in case you reintroduce some other type of pathogen from your house. I don't know what the rules are, so I can't advise. But if you do have one, and if you have collected one already, don't go and release it, because that is a quick way to get new pathogens into your population.
That's how I learned about frogs as a kid too, by catching them.
It's the common way. I think that the population effects of that are pretty minimal unless everybody goes out and collects frogs. But they're pretty cool to see up close, and I can't really call anyone out for it, because it's exactly what I did as a kid.
Okay, last question that we currently have, unless anybody else wants to type one in. How long can leopard frogs survive without moisture? Or how little moisture can they survive with?
I think if you had them in a complete sort of chamber with no cover, I don't think they would last very long. I don't know exact amount of time, but you'd be impressed how good they are at finding that last bit of moisture under a piece of wood or in some dense grass. They're very resilient. There's a reason they're still here, because this isn't the first drought we've had, and it's not going to be the last. So yeah, they're quite adept at finding moisture. But you know, they still are an amphibian, and they're still a semi-aquatic amphibian. So they do desiccate, and they will die. You certainly wouldn't want them trapped on a road, you know, by barriers or something, because they won't last long like that.
Okay, and we have one more question here, and it's a good one. So Alyssa says, I have a photograph along with the exact location, date, and time I took the photograph of a northern leopard frog from a few years back. She didn't realize there would be an importance in the sighting at the time. Is this information still useful to be reported now? Or is it something to remember for the future going forward?
Well, what I would say is that the more people that report things, the better. Now, leopard frogs can be quite common, so it might not be a surprise in some areas that there are leopard frogs, but so things like iNaturalist are kind of perfect for that, where you just put it on there, you make an account, you put a picture of a leopard frog every year from the same pond, and then, you know, if there's no longer leopard frogs in that pond 20 years from now, people say, well, there definitely were then. So a lot of these reports, you know, a single report, you don't need to feel guilty about not reporting every leopard frog you see, but an amalgam of reports, if everyone's reporting some of the things they see, gives us a much better baseline in order to decide what's happening with some of these populations and whether they need more assistance or less assistance, or just humans to get hands off and let them do their thing, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, I think that's all the questions we have for now. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks again, Nick. So that brings us to the end of our scheduled programming. So on behalf of Nature Saskatchewan and the Saskatchewan Prairie Conservation Action Plan, I would like to sincerely thank Carmen, Krista, Diego, and Nick for their great presentations today, and to our listeners for tuning in. Thank you all very much for attending this event. You'll receive an email after this presentation with a quick questionnaire. Please fill it out. It will just take like a minute or two. These surveys really help improve our events, and we take the feedback seriously, so we really appreciate your input. We have another event planned for March 15th, where Ian Cook from Birds Canada will talk about grassland resources, and Lori from the Saskatchewan Burrowing Owl Interpretive Center will be talking about burrowing owls. Also remember to check out the Nature Sask or the Pcapp YouTube channels in the near future for the recording of this video if you want to rewatch any of the presentations. And there's also all of our like past webinar recordings as well. So thank you everyone and have a great evening.